Welcome to another episode of the Fertility Conversations podcast. Today, we're joined by a lovely guest, Hayley King. She's the founder of All Things Donor Conception, and she's an advocate, an educator, a speaker. She joins us today to share her journey and also share all that she does to support and advocate for the donor conception community. So welcome, Hayley, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on, Ola. It's a privilege to speak to you today.
Yay, thank you. To start off, we usually say, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose a good place to start is my story at the beginning. So I'm both a donor-conceived person and in a twist of fate, a parent to donor-conceived children with my wife. But I suppose my story started in the early sort of 1980s where my parents were having fertility treatment and they were very fortunate to have treatment at the very first IVF clinic in the world at Bourne Hall in Cambridgeshire. After many years of infertility issues, both my dad had problems and my mum. But thankfully, after the second round of IVF, I came along and I was one of the first IVF babies conceived in the UK. And it was a celebrated story growing up. I kind of knew about that. My parents told me around 12 that was my story. But sadly, what I didn't know and what I found out very late in life in my 30s, that as part of that very early pioneering treatment, they used an anonymous sperm donor. So my dad that raised me, my lovely dad, sadly wasn't my genetic father. So obviously that came as a huge shock. So yeah, I found that out about 10 years ago now. Like I say, I'm actually a gay woman. So I was been married to a woman now for over a decade, and we wanted to start a family. And obviously in order to do that, we would need to use a sperm donor. So like I say, fast forward a number of years, we ended up having twins through donor sperm IVF. My wife carried, and we used her eggs. And then, so I suppose I'm in both camps, if you like. And that's kind of, I suppose, where my story started, because it's slightly unusual in the sense that I'm kind of both a parent through donor conception and a donor conceived person. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wow. But finding out, I mean, it's great. Again, amazing that you're one of the first IVF babies in the UK. That must have really impacted a lot when you're younger. You must have been like a celeb.
Yeah. Well, I don't know much about a celebrity. It was kind of just a really interesting fact. I don't know, like, we've all, I suppose, as I got older, at 12, it didn't really mean much to me. Right. I was kind of sat down and my parents brought out a load of newspaper articles and showed me all the newspaper articles, and they were kind of regional. You could imagine back, obviously we didn't have the internet as much then. So it was all like these kind of faded news. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was like miracle test tube baby and my picture of my lovely dad holding me, and lots of like little newspaper clips. And I suppose at that time, the late 70s, early 80s, obviously the first IVF baby had only come along a couple of years before me, right. Louise Brown. So it was still of great interest. It was kind of, that's all I kind of knew. And it wasn't, I think my parents had obviously gone through treatment in an era where IVF was still quite frowned upon, a real taboo subject. I know it still is, obviously, in many parts of the world. Yeah. But obviously back in the 70s and 80s, it was very much an unknown.
They were really bold.
Yeah. And, I look back now and my parents were kind of pioneers in their own right, really, by going through that treatment. So, yeah, and it was, like I say, it was very much a celebrated story, but sadly, like I say, that as part of that treatment, like I say, an anonymous donor was used, but they were told not to tell me that part. The doctors, it was quite common practice back then. Again, they didn't really know a lot about donor conception, really, certainly through IVF. It was very new. My parents were just advised that Hayley's better off not knowing, just carry on as if, nothing happened. But like I say, sadly, that came out in a family argument, when I was about 30 years old. So obviously that was a huge shock. That's kind of where I was with that one.
So when you found out about the fact that you're donor conceived as well, how did that feel? And did you even try to, how did that feel first, I think?
It was a huge shock. I think at first I kind of went through different stages, kind of in a bit of disbelief. I kind of questioned whether that was right. So my parents, to give a little bit of context, obviously back at that time, 40 years ago now, over 40 years ago, my parents weren't really told a lot, actually. My mum was treated as the patient, and my dad wasn't really involved much.
Right.
So that, and obviously their memories faded. You know, my parents are now in their, you know, late 70s. So I think they were only told certain bits of information. So I wasn't really taught, other than that a donor was used to create me. My parents really couldn't give me any more info than that. They had no info other than that he might have been a medical, someone from the medical field, like a doctor, from the doctor, you know, might have been a doctor or a medical student. That was all that they were really told. And that obviously whoever this donor was, had similar coloring to me, whatever that means. So and that was it. So there was a lot of unknown. So I had the shock, the unknown, real sadness as well, because obviously I'd grown up thinking my dad, who I have a very, very good relationship with, and was proper daddy's girl growing up, suddenly that connection that I thought I had evaporated overnight, essentially. And that, like I say, so we did do a straightforward paternity test when all of this information came out, just to check. And I think that upon reflection, I knew what the answer was going to be, but I just needed that kind of confirmation. And sadly, obviously, it came back that there was no chance that my dad was my genetic father. And to be honest, after that, I didn't really do a lot with the information, actually. I think I was in such shock over it. I kind of just buried it a little bit. I had a lot going on in my own life with my career. I had some health problems, and I didn't really do a lot with the information for a number of years. And I think it was only then when my wife and I went on to have our own family, and we started talking about IVF treatment and donor conception a few years later, that, I started thinking a little bit more about my own situation.
Right. And how has that impacted your relationship with your dad? Because of course you mentioned that you had an excellent relationship with him growing up.
Yeah. I mean, it was, I think, I'm not going to lie, at the start, it was very difficult in our family. I think it wasn't so much just my relationship with my dad, but my relationship with my parents, because your parents are the people that raise you, love you, care for you. And of course, they've done all of that. And I had a wonderful childhood, very loving, supportive parents. But there was this huge thing that I all of a sudden felt like I'd been lied to, or certainly had information kept from me that was really pertinent to who I was as an individual. And so there was a lot of issues over trust. And I think I went for a period of time of questioning a lot of things. So things maybe that my parents had told me growing up, or even things like, you might have listeners that are familiar with, within your families, you talk about where you get certain traits from, or you might have got that from great Auntie May, or, and there was all these stories that I'd been told as a child and growing up, that from my dad's side of the family, that I maybe had got this trait or that trait from. And all of a sudden that again was wrong. It was built on sand. So there was a lot of trust issues, I think, but we did do a lot of work as a family. My parents, for them, it was a huge shock, because I don't think, although it came out as a disclosure from them in an argument, I don't think it was ever really, they were never intending to tell me. So for them, there was a lot of work, because they buried it themselves, I think, for decades. But I think, I'm 10 years down the line from that event now. And actually, I think, there's lots of things have happened in that time. Stuff I've done to research my background and DNA test and things like that. But I've been very open and honest with my parents about that journey. And I think actually that's helped to rebuild some of that relationship back. And now my dad and I have a very, very good relationship. And in a weird kind of way, I have more respect for him, because he's raised me as an amazing father, regardless of all of this, but actually knowing that he's raised me and we don't share genetics, and he's always known that, and still been the most incredible father, I actually do have more respect for him in some ways. But I don't want to brush over the fact that it wasn't challenging, obviously, when all this information came out.
And of course, like you said, in their time, they were advised not to tell, and everything was all new. But of course, we're still having these conversations now, people thinking, will they tell the child or children? And for me, which is why I asked you, like, how has that impacted your relationship? Because I think it's important that people know the impact that it can have if children find out much later. And of course, in your case, we're glad that things settled down and you're still doing great. Your relationship with your father is amazing. But for anyone listening and at that point thinking, Well, should I tell the child or children? What would you say to them?
100% tell. Yes, I think not just from my point of view, but research now shows that it's in the best interests of the child and the surrounding family unit, actually, to tell children the truth of their genetic origins from as young as possible, actually. And I don't want to say that it's not it's actually very difficult to tell, and I want to appreciate that as a parent myself now. It's not as straightforward as, you just sitting down and just blurting it all out. There's lots of work I think we need to do as parents to get ourselves confident and comfortable talking about our children's conception story. Certainly if we've had, for many couples and individuals, they've had many years of infertility, for example, and a lot of grief there and a lot of challenging events to work through, and then all of a sudden you've got this amazing baby, but actually, and having these discussions can be quite emotional for the parent. But I think, yes, we need to work through that in order that we're able to disclose to our children about their origins, because essentially, I would just say I'm a prime example. If you don't tell, the chances are now, with the advent of commercial DNA testing, anonymity kind of can't be promised anymore, because these, like you say, these DNA kits, you can take, people may have heard of ancestry.com or 23andMe and MyHeritage. And just to give some context as well, when I first found out about my conception story, these DNA kits were over £300-400. So it was kind of very much, not attainable for many people. But now they've come down. I saw one over Christmas for Ancestry and it was like £40. So people are buying them for presents, for kits. So what I would say is, even if you're listening to this and you've got an older donor conceived child, or, a donor conceived young person, and you haven't disclosed, it's still not too late to do that. And I would say that it's always in your interest to disclose, because there is a chance that your child and your adult child may find out through doing one of these kits. And it may not be because they bought themselves a kit to look. It might just be that they get given it as a gift for Christmas or for a birthday or whatever. So I would definitely say it's in the best interest of everyone to disclose the truth.
Thank you for sharing. And I think going back to your situation, and one of the questions that people usually have is that if I tell, will the child see me as the real parent or not? So in your case, after you found out, did you go out and seek out the donor? And has this impacted how you see your dad?
Yeah, I don't speak for obviously every donor conceived person, but I've spoken to many, many donor conceived people over several years of working within the community. And I have never come across a donor conceived person that has found out, whether they've always known they're donor conceived or whether, like myself, have found out late in life. I've never really spoken to a donor conceived person who has gone seeking out the donor because they want to replace the parent that has raised them. I do think that there is a lot of curiosity, and I think that's a very distinct difference. I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about why donor conceived people want to find out information about their genetic heritage. A lot of donors think that they're maybe looking for inheritance, or all these kinds of things, like all these different stories you could probably think of. But in the majority of cases, it is just because donor conceived people are curious. So but going back to my story, when I found out, so like I say, 10 years ago, I actually didn't do much with that info and kind of sat on it. And again, there wasn't many options for me because I was born, because one of the oldies, if you like. So I was born before any regulation or any, so I was born, conceived and born in the UK. So we've got the Human Fertilization Embryology Authority here. So that didn't come into force until 1991, 10 years, after I was born. So there were no records of me. I went back to Bourne Hall and where I was conceived, and there was no records. I didn't exist. So I didn't really have many options to look, I suppose, 10 years ago. But obviously, as DNA testing has come on massively, and the kit prices have come down, I've been able to do some investigative work, I suppose, on my genetic heritage that way. So for me, and like I say, I didn't really have that curiosity really until I became a parent myself. And I don't know whether that's just because it brought up lots of emotions in me because I then became a parent. And having spoken to a lot of donor conceived people, I do think people's feelings change over time. So you may have someone that's not that bothered as a teenager that their donor conceived, but maybe when they go on to have their own family, a little bit like me, I suppose, maybe it does change you, I think, doesn't it? It makes you think a little bit differently. Yeah, and then you may find that a donor conceived person then does become a little bit more curious. But yeah, I mean, I have searched and I have been able to find my genetic father, donor, whatever. I mean, that's another discussion in itself, terminology.
Yeah.
And we could probably go down another rabbit hole with that, Ola. But yeah, I mean, I've been able to, I call him Jonathan, that's his name. I've been able to find him through extensive genealogy kind of searching, and several of my own donor siblings. So that's other individuals that were conceived using Jonathan's sperm. So that's kind of where I'm at now with it.
Which is great. I mean, I guess
yeah.
it's good to know, right? Again, like you said, it's not, no one is trying to replace who their parent is. They just want to know, just like you'll be curious even within your family, if you're not using a donor, if you're not conceived using a donor, like you would want to know what's that uncle like, or grandpa or grandma, whatever the case might be.
Yeah, and that's it. And I think it just shows you how popular these test kits are, for example. It's because people are interested, they're curious about whether it's an old great grandparent that fought in the war, or whatever it may be. And I think that donor conceived people are no different to that. We're curious, we're human beings. But I think because there is a lot of sometimes, like I say, a bit of a misconception, I think, that and parents become, and understandably, again, because I'm a parent and I do get it, I understand that there is that element of threat or worry that they're going to be replaced, or the parent's going to be replaced. And a lot of the times it's nothing to do with that. It's just, a lot of it comes down to curiosity. And medical history. That's another big one. A lot of studies have shown that donor conceived people do actually want to seek out genetic relatives to find out actually accurate medical history, because obviously a lot of the time donor conceived people aren't given accurate medical history. So that's another kind of big motivating factor that people do go looking.
Right. And of course, I mean, actually that makes me think about when people are thinking, should they use a known donor on anonymous donor? And of course, in some cases, people don't have the choice because that's just what's available. But if they did have a choice and trying to decide on how to proceed, what would you say from your experience will be a better option?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, I think. And I think truthfully, we don't know enough actually about the different types of donors and what's best practice. I think would probably be, people have got their own opinions. People provide lots of opinions online anecdotally about what they feel should be the correct way to do it. I'm always a bit mindful of that, because I'm very aware that, again, like you pointed out there, Ola, depending on where you are in the world will impact the type of donor. For example, if you're in Germany and you want to use an egg donor, it's actually illegal to use an egg donor in Germany. So that discounts you automatically. Certain countries have general anonymity laws. So you may want to use a known donor or someone that you know, but a clinic wouldn't take them. They wouldn't be allowed to have treatment. Or you may have an only option is through a sperm bank, which is anonymous. Obviously, in the UK, we do have open ID laws, which means that if you're somebody that's going through treatment and needs a donor at a HFEA clinic in the UK to conceive, that donor, regardless of where the donor's from, will be open ID at 18, which means that any person born, so any donor conceived person born since 2005, has the legal right to apply for information, identifying information of the donor when they turn 18. Now, that potentially may change as our laws move forward. And I think, like I say, it's a very nuanced topic. I think if people have the option to go for an open ID at 18 donor, I would 100% recommend trying to have a donor that is open ID. And I think, one, that's because I do think that donor conceived people, if they are interested, because not all donor conceived people are interested in knowing the identity, but if they are, then I do feel that that person has the right to find out who the donor is. Lots of people use known donors now, so that will be someone that is known to them, so known from birth. And I do think there are many, many positives to that. One being that you know the identity from day one, or even before that, from preconception, obviously. But for many vulnerable communities, so the LGBTQ communities, solo parent communities, certain communities around the world where known donation isn't really recognized, and there could be conflicts over legal parentage, for example. So it can be very complicated, basically, from where you are in the world.
Exactly.
My advice would be to research the hell out of it, where you live, what your options are, and make some informed choices, because I think actually what happens at the moment is a lot of people are making very ill-informed choices because they just haven't got the information. So they're very much led by their clinics or whatever, which sadly some of the clinics aren't best informed either. So yeah, definitely do your homework. But I haven't really answered your question. I'm sorry, but
no, that's good to say.
It's a difficult topic.
Yeah.
And maybe if you speak to me in 10 years' time, we may know more through research to say, actually, known donation is better, or actually there's no difference between open ID donation and anonymous donation. But at the moment, I don't think we've got the breadth of research to say that outright. So
right. I say that because actually I come across a lot of women and even that want to go using a donor, and they always say, well, I'd rather use a friend or someone I know, because then they know the history or any medical conditions. But of course, it also has its own risk in the sense that if there are no proper guidelines or perhaps agreement, if you can, I don't know, especially like in Nigeria, for example, there is no agreement that is going to override the fact that the person is the genetic father. Yes. If for example, you use a friend. So that person came back tomorrow and said, well, that's my child.
Exactly.
You could have a lot of issues at the courts and trying to fight this out and trying to prove who actually is he or is he not. So I think that's one of the issues that some people have when also considering this, and when there are no specific laws guiding the options. So I just thought to...
Yeah, and it is challenging, and I really sympathize, actually. I mean, my wife and I considered a known donor. I mean, first of all, you've got to have someone in mind, and that's a big issue. I mean, people sort of fly this comment around the internet, well, just use a known donor. But actually, when it comes to it, it's really hard to find someone that you trust, first of all, someone that's healthy. So, for example, my wife and I did have someone in mind, but they had some quite severe potential medical problems that we didn't want any of our children to inherit. So kind of ruled him out. But we didn't really know anybody else. You can, and I appreciate that there are different ways that you can find donors, but, if you don't know anybody, that, again, there's a huge difference between a known donor and someone that's known to you, someone that you know and trust, and someone that you just maybe, many people now will match with donors on apps almost, Facebook groups. And whilst, I know scenarios that it's worked very well and they've built a very good relationship with that person. If you've just met somebody off the internet, there are, potentially considerable risks to yourself, both safety and, like you say, legal implications if you don't really know this person because you've only just met. So it's very, very complicated. And it is a bit of a minefield, I think, to navigate, because the flip side is you maybe want to give your child that identifying information from birth, which can have very positive impact, say, for things like, say, your child's curious and wants to know, did the donor like football when he was younger, or did he, I don't know, the egg donor, was she interested in horse riding, or as kids, because kids are curious. And that's what I was saying. A lot of parents think, I don't have to worry about that now for 18 years, but actually the practicalities is our kids, are curious. If you've got a very curious child, having a known donor can be very helpful, because you can go to that person and say, actually, were you interested? What were you interested in as a kid? Did you like this? And then also, very importantly, medical history. You get updated medical history with a known donor. So, but the flip side is that legalities, depending on where you are in the world, whether you can that's even an accessible option for you. It's just very, very complicated. So that's why I always say to people, it's just look at what's available to you. Look at what's important to you, do your research, and then, just see what your options are really moving forward.
Thank you for that.
Right.
And of course, you speak a lot about your kids, and I just wanted to see, having found out that you were conceived in that whole process, and of course, you also highlighted earlier that you were not really thinking about a lot of things until you wanted to have your own children. How did your experience impact how you moved forward in terms of you then choosing a donor, or the whole procedure and your plans for your children, and how to tell them, and how that impacts?
It did impact me quite a bit, I think, right at the start. So because we're in the UK, we were always going to be we were always going to use an open ID donor. So
Right.
that's a donor that would be identifiable. So, and to me, it was very important actually that our children had that option. So even if it was a choice to have an anonymous donor, we wouldn't have gone for that, because I think what had happened to me, and we always did feel that if our children were curious, going back to kind of the whole curiosity thing, and they did want to know, then we would like to have offered them the opportunity to know who he was.
Right.
Like I say, we did consider a known donor for obviously some of the reasons I've already given. But yeah, it just wasn't really an option for us. And I think also you got to think this was 8 years ago when my wife and I started having treatment. And there wasn't really, I didn't really know anybody that had used a known donor. There wasn't really any, the discussion groups weren't really there. We were very mindful as a gay couple of legal entitlements, and we were a bit worried about the kind of implications of that. So again, all of that kind of played into our decision making. So we did feel very confident using an open ID at 18 donor. But I think actually at this point I hadn't DNA tested myself. So some of the maybe complexities, I suppose, with donor conception, I hadn't actually encountered yet myself because I hadn't DNA tested. Right. And it was only after our children, maybe when they were about 2 years old, I really became curious about who my donor was, my genetic father. So I think that kind of amplified our need, I think, with our own kids to make sure that maybe we're going to do things a little bit differently. So we were very proactive with talking to our children about the conception story. So we started very young. We got a few very basic donor conception storybooks that. And our children weren't even talking, they were, babes in arms, really. But it was helpful to have the books because it got us familiar with talking to them about the story, because it was a bit awkward and a bit challenging, a bit, it wasn't like your normal storybook you'd read. It was obviously talking about their conception story, and there was a lot of emotion brought up in that. But we made a real concerted effort, I think, to do that when our kids were young. And I would think that I say that was probably the main thing that we were very keen to do, which was to obviously change the situation, I suppose, very different to how I was kind of raised in that sense, the fact that I was raised not knowing. Right. So we've made very concerted efforts. And yeah, I suppose that's kind of really shaped it. And then as the kids have got older, they've become a little bit more curious. And I think most people will say, well, you're two women in a relationship, it's going to be quite obvious at some point to your children that, somebody else was involved. And I would say, yes, of course, that's true. But actually, I think in some ways, some parents rely on that, actually. And if you think about it, to a 4 or 5 year old, they don't really know how babies are made exactly yet. So if you're not telling, we're not talking about sex here. We're talking about actually an egg and a sperm and a body to grow a baby. And that's as basic as it needs to be. But our children don't know that. They just see mummy and mama. And they don't know that necessarily a third person's genetics was involved or a third person was involved in their creation unless we tell them. Yeah. And I have heard stories where, in gay relationships or same-sex couples where they've had donor conceived children and they've not really actively had these conversations with their kids. And then they get older, like 10 or 11, and the penny drops. And all of a sudden, there's a huge shock involved. So it's a different kind of shock. It's a shock that actually I'm not genetically related to mammy and mama or daddy and dada. There is this other. So there's another element to it as well. So that's why I say about being proactive is quite a difference than kind of just assuming that your children are going to know just because of your family setup. So,
right. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And you mentioned that you started when you were much younger, even as young as 2, because that's the question lots of people have. When should they start? And are there any resources or where you think you can point people to if they're looking for perhaps guidance on ideas on how to approach it or to have that conversation?
Yeah, sure. So most people start with children's storybooks. And like I say, a few years ago, there wasn't much choice, but now there's like dozens of books available for every type of family, whether you're mum and dad family or 2 mummies, 2 daddies or whatever, or solo mum, solo dad. Whether you've used surrogacy, like you can think every different family combination, there's a book for it. So I would definitely say, reach out, look for a book that you think fits your family. I've actually got, so if anyone's interested in taking a look at my website, allthingsdonorconception.com, I've got a free downloadable resource on there. It's called the Nugget series, which is just full of like helpful resources really. And as part of that, there's a whole list of children's storybooks that I personally really like. So people can go on there and have a little look, and then look on the internet and see which one fits them. I mean, some of the books now are even personalized, so you can put your own photo in, and your own. Just had one done recently, which is like a little caricature of me and my wife and our kids, and really like. Whereas a few years ago, it was you didn't have a lot of choice. So I definitely say check those out. So that's kind of how I would say to start off talking. Is just get yourself a little bit more familiar with the words you're going to use and the terminology that you feel comfortable using, because all of these things, like, I don't think parents really think about that much, obviously, until the children are here, and it can become a bit of a stumbling block actually if you don't kind of work through those things. So that would be my first piece of advice. Yeah, grab yourself a good storybook.
Thank you. And so important, because again, like you said, lots of people just don't know. I mean, they want to, but they just don't know how to approach it, and they keep postponing it because they think, well, I'll probably just do it when it's 5 or when they're 7, and then you never know, and then it never gets told. So,
and that's it, and that does happen. And I think it becomes like with any kind of thing that you're avoiding, the avoidant thing starts like that, and then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger to the point that you're then dealing with maybe a 7 or 8-year-old. And don't get me wrong, you can disclose at 7 or 8. I mean, there's there are resources and things to kind of how that disclosure may change depending on the age of your child. But if we're if someone's listening and they've maybe got a newborn or a young child, say under the age of 4, you can just start with the storybooks. If your child's a little bit older and a little bit more aware of the world around them, if you like, and a little bit more, they've got to that kind of development stage that they understand a bit more, you may then have to kind of approach things a little bit more, like, because they will talk to you back, when under 4 you're kind of doing the talking, whereas if we were to just start disclosing that information to our kids now and they're nearly 7, like my little boy can read better than I can, to be honest. He's very good at reading, so he'd be asking so many questions. So what I'm saying is that it would change slightly, but the foundation of the story, if you like, would be the same. And again, then with teenagers is obviously different again, because obviously they've grown up knowing a certain story, and then all of a sudden to be told something different, you may have some complicated feelings come up for that teenager. So, but I would definitely recommend, again, in that resources that I referred to off my website, there's a great perinatal psychologist that I do a lot of work with, who would be able to help parents through that process, if they were really struggling and things. So yeah, definitely just reach out for support. There's support out there. So
thank you. And of course, knowing your experience as conceived and then going forward to have your own children, you then started off All Things Donor Conception. What was the inspiration behind starting that?
So I suppose for people that might not have come across me, so I started kind of blogging, is that the right word, or like talking about my story on Instagram. Actually, someone branded it, because I used to do a lot of work in sort of Facebook groups. I used to admin a big parent Facebook group for donor conception, and someone approached me and said, could you do one of these, I'd never heard of it, an IG live on Instagram. And I was like, I haven't even got an Instagram account, didn't even know what it was, totally a bit archaic with my social media at that a few years ago. So I thought, right, I'm gonna have to set up an Instagram account. I've avoided it for ages, didn't really understand Instagram, so I set up an Instagram account, did this IG live, and it kind of just spiraled. Actually, I had more and more people following me and DMing me, and it got to the point I started doing a little bit of work for an online support platform called Paths to Parenthood, which we can talk a little bit about later if you'd like. But because I was doing all these little things, I suppose, and talking about my story, I was finding I was getting contacted a lot, actually, in my DMs, and I wanted to be able to refer people somewhere, because it was becoming quite time consuming, and I wanted to be able to help, but a lot of the time I just couldn't reply to people. I just didn't have the time. So I thought, right, I'm going to set up a website. So I set up a website, which kind of would be a place that, because we know Instagram can be amazing, but the posts get lost, don't they? And there's no real kind of structure necessarily to it. So I put all the details of, I suppose, my story, some long form blog posts, but I've also, which I'm really proud of, I've got a huge free resources section on my website, which is for all members of the donor conceived community. So whether you're a donor, a professional, a parent, a donor conceived person, you can click on there, and that you can have, it gives you free resources. All the links I put on there are free. freely accessible, but also signpost people to further support, which I think is really important. So that was kind of my motivation for it. And also I was starting to do, people contacting me to do kind of public speaking jobs, and inviting me to conferences and things like that. So I've got a little page on there, a little bit about myself and kind of what I do, really. So that was my main inspiration, I suppose, is to have somewhere central to send people.
Well done.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Because again, it is so needed. The reality is that infertility is rising globally. Lots of people are having to consider or explore donor conception for whatever reason, either for infertility or perhaps their own unique family situation. So it is important that people have the support, but also know that the children that might be born and the families as well surrounding them have the support, because people just don't know. IVF is still highly stigmatized in many countries, and then adding the additional layer of donor conception could even be more challenging for some. And again, still so much stigma, misconceptions around it. So having a resource where people can reach out and find support is amazing.
Yeah, and it's like I've just found it quite rewarding, I suppose, that people have said it's been helpful. But I think, like you say, it's just trying to make sure that people can find the support when they need it. It's nothing worse like having someone reach out to you in an instant message. You've probably had it yourself as well, where you can just sense the sadness or the desperation or the kind of, they just sound lost, really. And I don't think anyone should feel like that, regardless of what their problem may be, even away from infertility or whatever. So it's been really nice. And there are some very good organizations out there, like you say, that support all parts of the donor conception community. It's just whether people are able to find them. So hopefully, that's my hope, is that I'm doing my little bit to kind of direct people in the right direction, to get in that support. Because ultimately, I think, going back to my story, and I've kind of moved through lots of stages of what's happened to me, but it was very traumatic, what happened. And I don't want to kind of brush too much over that, because it was really shocking event. And I just don't, I'd hate for other people to kind of, other families to kind of go through what our family has, actually, including my mum and dad in that, just because they maybe didn't get the support. So because they didn't get the support, they didn't feel they had the confidence to tell the children. As a result, they didn't tell their kids, and their kids found out at 20 doing a DNA test that, and you can see how the ripple effect can come. And a lot of that is because maybe the information and the education and the support wasn't there from day dot. It's been great to see. I think more and more is, again, it's very dependent on where you are in the world, but certainly in the UK, it seems to be that there is more support, becoming available for parents through donor conception and donor conceived people too.
Yeah. And so rightly said, because there is support needed for everyone, both the parents that are considering, the intended parents considering donor conception, the children born out of it, perhaps the families. Lots of people need support for different reasons.
And the donors, the donors too. They've often get overlooked, donors.
They get you see, I never even mentioned them.
I know.
Of course, because
exactly. And I think that a lot of people think, even donors, and again, this is why I sort of put it back at the clinics. I'm a big advocate for talking. I'm doing a lot more talks now with professionals, because it doesn't always filter down. When parents or intended parents are going through implications counselling, for example, the discussions may not actually think, well, what, how are you going to talk to your kids? Or because implication counselling doesn't always happen. Same with the donors. A lot of clinics now, sadly, are withdrawing implications counselling for the donors. So these donors are going in, a lot of the time, young men and women, they're not really thinking about 18 years down the line, or because of DNA testing.
Exactly.
They less than
10 years,
people, it's happening. And what I was saying is, it's like, they need support too, these donors, because actually it's not a case of just donating and that's the end of that. I mean, going back to Jonathan, my genetic father, I mean, he gave his donations as a med student, never thought, looked back, and that was the end of that. He was never, we joke about it now, paid for his board and some of his rent in London when he was a medical student. And that was his motivation. It was a nice thing that he was helping families, but never anticipated that, I'd pop up and go, hello,
I know, by the way.
Hi. And I'm very fortunate, because he's been really welcoming and a lovely guy. But if he had, I mean, he's actually a gay man himself, never had children. So for me, it's been quite, I think in that sense, quite helpful because he hasn't got any complications in his family.
Right.
But there's lots of donors that donated not that long ago, even, that have maybe not been counseled enough to say, well, actually, you're going to have to tell your partners that you've been a donor, or your children, because your children will then technically be half siblings to these donor conceived people that you've helped to create. And yeah, again, so like, again, the ripple effect is that these donors aren't telling their families and their children, and then it comes out in a DNA test or whatever it may be years down the line and causes huge problems, you know, understandably, for these donors. So yeah, they, like I say, is that the whole spectrum of support needs to be there, really. But sadly, I would say it is getting better, but it still could be a lot better. You know, it could be a lot more improved. So
yeah, and when you mentioned that, actually, as well, even for the clinics to be mindful of the amount of families that potentially being created as well, because you could have a whole lot of people who are half siblings in so many places, or even close proximity.
Yes. That
so
is a problem. I mean, the UK, we do have a 10 family limit. So, but it's a little bit of a red herring, actually. So just for anyone that's not aware, you can have, so say you go for a treatment at a UK clinic, and you use a donor, obviously, say a sperm donor, because they tend to obviously create, because of the nature of it, it tends to create more families with one sperm donor. So in the UK, that sperm donor can only be used for 10 families. That's not 10 children, that's 10 families. Not including the donor. So you could have the donor, he could get married 3 times and have children with 3 different women, for example, and create 10 families in the UK. So they do try to limit it within the UK jurisdiction, and other countries have similar kind of levels. I think Denmark's 12. You know, all the different countries around Europe have their own kind of limits. But what isn't always explained, going back to the clinics, and sometimes the clinic staff aren't aware of this, if you're using a donor, say, that's been imported in, so not maybe so from America. So say we've got a lot of UK clinics now, because parents understandably want a choice of donors to use. They will partner with, say, a US sperm bank, very big sperm banks in the US, where they have no regulation at all, really. So that donor will only be used, potentially, that US donor that's being imported for a UK family to be used, will be used for 10 families in the UK, yes, but could be used for 30 in the US, 50 around Europe. You know, there is no,
even
there is no cap. There is no cap. So I think that's what I would like to see, obviously, if there was some kind of worldwide cap. I mean, how that would be done, I don't know, but it would probably have to be done at a sperm bank level, because they're the ones that are controlling, you know, these gametes being shipped around. But yeah, I think that's quite important, and so many parents aren't aware of that. So they just think, right, I'm in the UK, it's only 10 families, and then maybe 6 or 7 years down the line, they try to connect with donor siblings, for example, so other families that have maybe used the same donor that they have, and there's lots of ways you can do that. And then all of a sudden they're thrown into a sibling group of 50 children from all over the world, and they're like, hang on, I thought it was 10 families. And it's like, well, it's 10 in the UK. So again, going back to this information sharing and making informed choices, a lot of parents sadly aren't given that info when they're making their donor choice. So it's a biggie. It is a biggie.
It is.
So,
but hoping all your advocacy, because you said that you're having a lot more conversations with professionals than in clinics, and perhaps this will start the conversation and help to encourage the changes, and even across sperm banks.
I mean, I've had some fantastic conversations with big sperm banks in Europe, and you know, with regulatory bodies here in the UK, and I think people are starting to listen. And sometimes I just think people didn't really realize that it was an issue. I don't know, that sounds bizarre, but I just think that you got to think, years ago, before DNA testing and before donor sibling registries, for example, these connections weren't really happening because people didn't know about each other, or didn't even know that they could connect. So you could have, you know, for myself, for example, Jonathan donated quite considerably during the early 80s. I've been able to find 3 other donor siblings that are related to me, but we don't know how many donor siblings I've got, because he, like I say, it could be dozens, really. But I don't know that. Whereas now there are lots of ways that you can connect, you know, through these sites and through sibling registry. So I think it's actually becoming more and more common that people are connecting. So I think it's almost become, people are realizing, well, hang on, these sibling groups of 50 to 100 children from one donor, they're actually becoming more and more common. I don't think it's more and more common. I just think they're being discovered more commonly. Exactly. I think it's always gone on.
So, yeah.
It's just that the way that people are able to connect these days with social media and everything, like I say, how DNA testing has evolved, it's become more, more people are aware. And again, it's just going back to people being able to say, right, okay, I'm going to use this donor. Where else is the donor being used, for example? Just ask some more questions with my advice. How many countries is this donor being used in? If it's just the UK, great. Is there any intention for his sperm to be exported, for example? Because that is beginning to happen now in the UK, potentially.
Right.
So yeah, it's a bit of a minefield. Like I say, we could do a whole podcast on sibling limits and family limits and things. And I don't want to blow people's minds, but it's just to kind of, it's just kind of scratching the surface really on some of these issues that parents just aren't aware of.
Yeah, and it's good to be aware, because then again, it helps you to perhaps do more research, ask more questions, which is better than not thinking about it at all.
Yeah, exactly. And just being able to ask the questions. And like, thankfully, I think, like you say, the clinics are kind of listening now as well. And I'm hopeful of change and a little bit more tighter regulation and things like that. Because I think most people would probably look, most donors as well aren't aware that they're, certainly some of the donors have said, oh, well, some of the, say, for US donors I know of were told when they donated that they'd only be used for, 20 families, and found out that they'd been used for a lot more than that. But because there's no regulation in the US, or very minimal regulation, it's just kind of advisory regulation. It's not enforceable in the majority of the states in the US. These sperm banks are kind of just getting away with it, really.
But hopefully we change. I mean, I think the moment you start having the conversations with some clinics and sperm banks and big ones, like you said, I think somehow, hopefully, we'll have to have more of those conversations across the globe.
Yes, yeah.
They'll somehow encourage people to at least look at it and consider how things could change.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the, and to be honest, I think some sperm banks are doing it, I talk a lot more about sperm banks because of that kind of has the biggest impact on family numbers. Egg banks obviously do, there can be lots of families created from one egg donor, but the nature of egg retrieval is obviously a lot more invasive compared to sperm, obviously donation. So that's where the difference is. So I'm talking a lot about sperm banks, but obviously it can apply to egg banks too. But I do think they are listening, and there's certain ones around the world that are kind of looking at their practices, I think, and offering parents things like reduced family limit donors and things like that. But sadly, it comes a lot of the time with increased cost.
Yeah, right.
And it's sad because it's like you kind of got a choice between your children having less siblings and potentially and paying 10 times the price, and not everyone can afford, everyone knows how expensive the treatment is. So yeah, it's a bit of a hard situation to be in, but at least, like I say, these conversations have started to happen, and I'm hopeful that, as more and more parents become aware, and essentially parents have got the buying power, we'll make our choices where we go and what clinics we use and what banks we use. That may start to influence some of the decision making if they kind of realize, well, actually, our potential customers are very interested in these kinds of issues. So yeah.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Fingers
and well
crossed,
done. Yeah. Well done, all you're doing to encourage the conversations.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. It's hard going sometimes.
It is, I'm sure.
You feel like you're shouting into the void, but we can all do our bit, can't we? So
yeah. And for clinics, they've been doing things, sperm banks, they've been doing this for years, and now you're trying to tell them something that could potentially reduce their income.
Yes. And I get the challenges that, and some of sadly, some of the people that I speak with at at the level of these clinics and banks, they understand and they get it, but they're not always the ones making the decisions, sadly. Right. It's the ones above them. So yeah, but again, hopefully these things will filter down eventually, and we'll see some more positive change. I mean, the only alternative is having regulatory change, isn't it? And it then being forced, but obviously we all know how hard that is to kind of do, kind of make it mandatory and all these things. So yeah, it is a tricky one.
Thank you for all that you're doing, though.
You're welcome.
And of course, people listening might want to reach out to you. And I know you mentioned your website, allthingsdonorconception.com. How else can they reach out to you? Is that the best way to reach out to you, or are there other ways for them to connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So obviously through my website, I've got an Instagram account. It's not the easiest handle. I didn't really think of it again, going back when I set it up. So it's DCP Journey to RP with a couple of underscores in there. So if you put in DCP Journey to RP, you should come across me on Instagram. Or if you type all things donor conception, I think it should come up.
Right.
So that I'm on Instagram. Like I say, I've got my website. I do like a free newsletter, which I need to be a bit more regular with, but I try and get out lots of info when I come across it. I also, like I say, work for Paths to Parenthood.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you. So yeah, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's essentially an online platform for parents through donor conception. So like I say, I away from that, I work with all members of the community, but Paths to Parenthood is specifically designed for parents or intended parents or anyone that's considering donor conception to build their families. It was established over 3 years ago now by a lady called Becky Kearns, who some may know as Defining Mum on Instagram. She does a lot of blogging about her story as a mum through egg donation. So it kind of started off from that, but we've expanded the platform, and we've got hundreds of members now that participate in monthly support and connection groups. So we run like virtual support and connection groups, a bit like over Zoom, like we're doing now, Ola. We have professional webinars. So we have, speakers, researchers that are interested in donor conception, very knowledgeable people come on and give specific talks about a topic, whether that's talking to your children, as we've obviously discussed in this episode, haven't we? And like how you can go about that and things you can do and phrases that you can use. We've got every topic you can think of. We've also got discussions with lots of donor conceived people, so from lots of different family setups. A lot of our members find that helpful, and we do a lot of live chats as well, so we'll just come on and speak to parents about their journeys, like I say, it is a subscription based platform, but it's really affordable at around 16 quid a month, and you can, like I say, cancel anytime. So a lot of people find that really helpful as a place of reference to go. You can, like I say, listen into the webinars and things, and like I say, it's just another place that parents can get specific support actually, and speak with other people that are in the same boat as them. We've got like a community app that people can talk privately to each other, away from social media and all the problems, that can come with that. So people can find me there, as well as obviously, like I say, through my own website or through Instagram. So yeah,
that's great. I'm going to put your Instagram details there as well. So I'll put the actual and the show notes. I'll put the link for your Instagram, sure. And of course, note the Paths to Parenthood as well. Yeah, so people can reach out, because I think, like we said, support is really needed, and it's always great to connect with others who understand what you're going through, perhaps what you're exploring as well.
Yeah, and like I say, it's we've got parents, like I say, from all different family types you can imagine. I tend to deal a lot with the LGBTQ community because obviously that relates to my family. But we've got parents that have used embryo donation, whether abroad or in the UK, or like I say, we've got an international membership as well. So I'm pretty confident that anyone listening to this, if you were to join, you would find someone that's in a very similar situation to yourself that you would find very relatable. So yeah,
so important. Thank you. And if you could go back in time, Hayley, to I don't know, 21-year-old Hayley, or perhaps 18, what will you tell her?
Apart from wearing sun cream more.
Yeah, that's important.
I wish I'd have done that younger. No, on a serious point, I think there's a song about that, actually, isn't there? There's a song about wearing sun cream. Anyway, I digress. I think, do you know what? I don't know. If it's specific to donor conception, obviously I didn't know my story. Part of me, obviously, I would have liked to have known younger. So I think, it's difficult because I wasn't told. I was told, in my 30s. So that's quite challenging. I suppose on a general rule, as a young woman, I suppose I would have told myself that it's going to be all right. I think I've been through lots of things in my life. I've had some medical problems. I've had a career-ending injury, for example, and lots of challenges. I think, like with my identity issues, whether that's my sexuality or whether finding out I was donor conceived and all these things, I would just tell myself that it would be okay, and you'll get through it, because I think we've probably all been in those situations where it's been a real challenge. So I would just kind of give myself my 20-year-old self a little bit of reassurance that you'll pull through and it'll be okay.
So important.
Yeah.
And as a wrap up, Hayley, what will you tell anyone listening, either an individual or couple currently considering donor conception?
I would
Any words of
say,
advice?
yeah, I would say again, research it. Do as much, maybe join one of the support platforms that I've mentioned, whether that's Paths to Parenthood, because I think the other option is that it can be quite overwhelming. I think when you're starting on this journey, certainly if you say join Facebook groups and you're listening to lots of conversations going on and you feel really conflicted. I actually had someone message me last night who just felt swamped, actually was the word that she used, swamped by the information. So I would, maybe get the information, but maybe be mindful of where you're going to get that information from, and kind of protecting yourself a little bit in that. Right. But I would say donor conception is a fabulous way to build your family. Yes, there are things to consider, and things to be mindful of, but just going back to my own story, my dad, who raised me, is the most wonderful man, and I feel incredibly blessed that he was able to be a dad, because without donor conception, he wouldn't have been a father. And it would have been an absolute travesty for my dad not to have been able to be a father, because he is, right. I've had the most wonderful childhood and he is the most wonderful dad. And it's enabled my wife and I to have a family too. So I would say it's a fantastic way to build your family and have confidence in that. But also, just be mindful, and just get a little bit of information before you kind of jump in. That would be my most bit of advice there. So
thank you so much, Hayley. I think it was really beautiful listening to that, your advice, because I think for many people that I've spoken with, people have often felt discouraged for different reasons, perhaps people they connect with on Instagram or Facebook or certain groups, and have felt that perhaps this might not be a good way to proceed based on people's personal experiences that were not so positive. Yeah. So I think you, considering how you were conceived and how you also considered children, giving that reassurance to people that it is a great way and a fabulous way to grow your family or create your family is really reassuring. But of course, you also stating the fact that it is important that you do things as best as possible, do your research, to have the proper disclosure and be open and transparent to the children. I think that was really helpful. Thank you. Because again, I have spoken to so many people who are just not feeling very confident about proceeding with this option. So I think having you say that is really amazing.
Yeah. And I appreciate that, Ola. And that's what I hope to achieve. I think I'm kind of a bit of a pragmatist, the way I want to be honest with people. There may be challenges going through donor conception, but it still can be an amazing way to build your family. And I would also say, if someone is in a situation where they're not feeling confident, maybe they're just considering it and they're not quite sure. I've spoken to hundreds of parents, whether through the social media work that I've done or through the parent platform that I work for. I think most parents would say that they've never been 100% confident going in, but as long as you're nearly there, I think that would probably be what I would say. So I think even even as like just parenting in general, there's lots of things that we're constantly learning, aren't we? And there's things that, even just nothing to do with donor conception, but looking back when my kids were 2, I think, oh, why didn't we do that? Or we should have maybe done that. And I think that's just parenting. I think you even do that before you become parents. Just like I say, just educate as much as you can, but also, don't worry if you're not completely 100% confident going through, because you will gain that confidence as you move through the process and hopefully go on to have your kind of longed for baby and longed for family. So I wish everyone the best of luck if you are in that situation that's listening.
Thank you so much, Hayley. It's been amazing having you here. I mean, I'm so glad you agreed to come on the podcast, because again, you're the best person to have come speak about donor conception because of your unique situation, being donor conceived and then having your children as well using a donor. So it's amazing having both of that experience. And of course, so having you here to share, it's been amazing. And thank you so much for the insights. It has been really insightful having you in here. So thank you for all that you're doing to support everyone. I just want you to know that it's helping a lot of people, even if they come to you or not, but they're being helped, and you're definitely encouraging a lot of people across the globe. So thank you.
No, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it, Ola.
Yeah, we look forward to having you again in the near future.
Yeah, why not? Well, like I say, this field is changing dramatically, even in the last few years that I've been working in it. So yeah, speak to me probably in another few years' time. We'll probably have a whole different level of conversation. But
Exactly.
that's the nature of it. And I think fertility treatment is a bit like that in itself, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So exciting times.
We should be open to change, that right?
Yes.
Learn and unlearn. That's the
Exactly.
process. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and thank you for all the work you're doing as well, Ola, because your podcast, will reach lots of people that may not have had the opportunity to have these conversations otherwise, or have these conversations in their ear. So thank you for inviting me on, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.